All right, we're back. It is Monday, April 20th, and we're talking about water. So today is all about hydrology and the hydrosphere. Let's get it. All right, so where's the water? Where does it go? Where does it come from? And what are its possible fates once it hits the ground? I could go on about this, but I think instead I'll have you watch a little video and you can take down some information while you watch. While you watch that video, I think I'm going to listen to a little track here. Water related, of course. All right. I realize you can't actually hear that track, but if you want to sync it up, hit Spotify. That's Shad K, London, Ontario raised. And that track's called Water. All right. Let's move on. Okay. After you watch that video, let's talk a little bit about the difference between natural, so undisturbed, versus urban landscapes. So versus what happens when people build cities. So the difference in terms of the differences are in terms of the fate or fates of water. What happens to that water once it hits the ground? So there's also going to be a little bit of difference in terms of evaporation and things like that. But the main differences are what happens once that water hits the ground. So if you take a look at the diagram that's on the screen, I'm going to focus first off in that natural landscape. So in the natural landscape, you see that when water hits the ground as rain, or even if it's snow and then eventually melts, you get a large percentage of that water infiltrating the soil. So actually going into the soil, and that will either, pardon me, that will either run off to a low point in the land, usually a stream, a creek, a river, a pond, something like that. Some of that water, about 25%, will infiltrate much deeper. So that goes all the way into groundwater, and which forms the water tables. So if you go far enough down, you'll reach a point where the land below, the rock below, is permanently saturated. So some of that water will go down for groundwater, and then you'll get a smaller percentage, maybe 10% or so, running off the land. So that runs off the land over the surface. And again, it will go downhill and reach a low point in either a creek, a stream, river, lake, something like that. And then you get about 40% that goes to evaporation. So that will evaporate back. And once again, the water cycle will continue. As that rises, the air will cool, condense, and those water droplets will fall back down. If you compare that now to the urban landscape, you see the main difference right now is the percentage that infiltrates the ground versus the percentage that runs off. So you get a much higher percentage of that water running off the land because those surfaces in urban landscapes are often impervious, meaning that they're either concrete, they're asphalt, there's something that does not allow water to penetrate. So what that means is you get a lot more surface runoff, a um, a quicker flow of that water off the land, and some of it goes directly into those low points, like I talked about, rivers and creeks and streams. But a lot of it will go straight into sewers. So that runoff goes right into storm sewers. And why that's a problem is in a city like London, which is pretty old, it's a couple hundred years old, we still have a lot of what are called combined sewers. So in London, other big cities around the world, we're working slowly to replace these. But what's combined are the storm sewers that are meant to collect runoff from rainfall, and the sanitary sewers, which collect the water that leaves your home and leaves businesses when you flush the toilet, and of course, down when you down the pipe when you take a shower, wash your hands, all that kind of stuff. Wash your hands. Wash your hands. Um, this is a problem for a couple reasons. The biggest problem with that is when it reaches, because both of those sources eventually go to a treatment plant. So you get the storm water, which isn't particularly dirty. It does have salt from the road, that sort of stuff. If you're in a could have fertilizer from people's lawns and things like that, but it's not sewage water, right? So it doesn't require that much treatment. Whereas the water coming from people's homes obviously requires a great deal of treatment. So both of those, since the sewers are combined, end up going to a sewage treatment plant. And under really high flow conditions, those treatment plants they can't hold all the water that's coming in. So what they'll do, so if it's raining heavily for a long period of time and people continue to flush their toilets as they're wont to do, eventually you get to a situation where the people at the sewage plant have to make a decision. And what they'll do is they'll open up a release valve and let some of that water bypass the sewage treatment plant and go directly into the river. So, yes, that's raw sewage directly entering the river. And in this case, that's the Thames River. Now, London's slowly been working to disconnect those combined sewers and have a separate system for stormwater versus a separate system for sanitary water, which is sewage coming from people's houses and businesses and things like that. And we don't get as many. Those are called bypass events, where you have raw sewage entering the system. We don't have that many of them anymore, but they still are. They still happen occasionally, especially as I said during those very high rain events where it's raining intensely for a fairly long period of time, causing a spike in that storm water, and then the normal flow you get from sanitary sewers for people flushing their toilets and that sort of thing. It can just overwhelm the system, and then that's when you get those bypass events. Terrible for the river. Okay, watersheds. So watersheds are maybe one of the most important concepts in in natural science that if they're not misunderstood, they're just not really understood at all. And it's really very simple. So a watershed is simply an area that in which all the water that falls on it drains to a specific point. So every single piece of land is in a watershed somewhere, because when water hits it, it goes somewhere. So you can imagine that diagram that you see. My face might be blocking it a little bit, but that white line shows the watershed boundary. So all the water that falls anywhere within that white outline will eventually go into those creeks, the streams, and there'll be a single outlet that drains the entire area. For in London, for example, all of the water that falls in London, Ontario will eventually make its way into the Thames River system, and that eventually will go all the way to Lake St. Clair. So the Thames River watershed is a large area of land in which all the water that falls on it will eventually make its way into the Thames River, which eventually makes its way into Lake St. Clair. So any water that falls in your backyard will eventually make its way to Lake St. Clair. Here's a look at the Thames River watershed. So if you see the map here, and you can take a look on your own time as well, all of that area that's within the red outline is the Thames River watershed. So anywhere within that boundary of that red line, if water falls on the land there, it will eventually make its way. So that blue is the Thames River. Here's London, where I'm highlighting right now. There's the north branch of the Thames. There's the south branch of the Thames. Doesn't matter where you are within this red line, anywhere water hits, it'll make its way into the Thames, which goes all the way down eventually into Lake St. Clair. And then eventually, even though it's not a Great Lake, it's part of that chain. Water goes from Lake Huron into Lake St. Clair, into Lake Erie, into Lake Ontario, out the St. Lawrence River, and into the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so we're now going to look at the subwatersheds of London. So a subwatershed, as it sounds, is just a smaller watershed within a bigger area. So anywhere around London within that area that you saw, that red line that you saw on that previous map, water will eventually go to Lake St. Clair, but there are a lot of smaller watersheds within that area. So, for example, I live close to Medway Creek, so water that falls in my backyard goes to, I'm part of the Medway Creek sub watershed. Medway Creek eventually connects to the Thames River, and of course, the Thames River flows all the way down to Lake St. Clair. So there are many of these sub watersheds within London, and you can kind of take a look, click on that link, and you'll see that there's some information about each of those watersheds. And these watersheds are managed by a conservation authority. So, one of the excellent things that Ontario did some time ago was we decided instead of using political boundaries to manage our water, we're going to use watershed boundaries because they don't know, the two are not usually not in sync. And water doesn't know anything about political boundaries. It only obeys those watershed boundaries. So Ontario was one of the first jurisdictions to decide to manage water by watersheds, which makes a lot more sense than political boundaries, um, where you see those. That's how it's managed in a lot of other areas. As part of the assignment this week, you're going to pick one of these sub watersheds, preferably in an area that is close by to you. It might be tough now. I don't want anyone to break the social distancing recommendations. So if it's not safe to go into that area right now because maybe it's overrun with people, I don't know, it depends. You can ignore that part. But if it is, so I'm still able to go into Medway Creek around here. But once again, please make sure you're practicing those physical distancing recommendations. Here are the sub watersheds that I was talking about around London. So each of these sub watersheds, the water that falls on the land will go to one of those creeks that you see here, and then into the main branch of the Thames River. One of them, so Beal, is located in the Forks sub watershed, meaning that there's not a little creek that the water that hits Beal will go into before it goes into the Thames. It just goes right into the Thames. All these other ones have smaller creeks that eventually feed into the Thames River. And what we have done, the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, they will come out with these things called watershed report cards. And these report cards will tell all sorts of things about both the land and water in terms of quality, quantity, changes in both quality and quantity, etc. So they'll tell you some stuff about pollutants in the water. So how clean is that water, relatively speaking? They'll tell you some stuff about the quantity of water. So what's the kind of natural variability in the flow of those creeks? It'll also tell you something about the landscape. So the forest cover, how much forest is usually there, what type of forest, what's the quality of it, etc. So they use that as a baseline to kind of analyze the system on a yearly basis, or maybe every couple of years, to see if we are truly improving, to see if the policies that we've enacted are improving, having an effect on the actual land and river within these watersheds. So every year or two, they'll go back and update that report card, and you can kind of see how they have progressed. So for your assignment, you're going to pick one of those, and I'll just click on one, for example. So I'm in Medway. I can click on the Medway Creek report card. So here you go. This last one was from 2017. Huh. Maybe I'm going to check the link before I post this. There might have been an updated one. But you can see that it gives, there's Medway Creek, the boundary there. So anything within that red outline will eventually flow into Medway Creek, which will eventually flow into the Thames River. And it tells me some information about Medway Creek, the soil, how many people live there, some land use, or their farms, is it mostly urban, etc. And then it tells me about the quality of the water. D, not a great grade. Passing, not great. And this is not the worst one by far. So it'll tell you why it received a certain grade, levels of phosphorus, which too much phosphorus can lead to harmful algal blooms. Bacteria, E. coli, obviously that's not good. That's usually from sewage. And a benthic score. So benthic just means the bottom. There are certain organisms that live in the sediment at the bottom, and depending on which ones you find, it indicates how healthy that ecosystem is. Not a great grade here, a D, a C, and a D. We also have forest conditions, D. Hmm. Okay, not great also, and they'll tell you why. The forest cover, so we only have, what's that, about under 10% forest cover. Not great. They recommend having about 30% forest cover for the entire city. That's kind of the recommended minimum. Looks here like we're at about 11, and in Midway Creek, it's under 10. So not very good. Percent forest interior, what that means is how much kind of intact contiguous forest is there. A lot of the forest that's on the edge, the kind of transition between true forest and more urban landscapes, isn't really suitable for a lot of creatures. So they need to have large tracts of contiguous forest. If it's only kind of narrow plots, that means you've got a lot of edge. That's not as good. And the riparian zone, riparian is the area adjacent to waterways. So the area that's right around streams and creeks. So you want that to be forested to prevent erosion and also to act as a buffer to prevent things from running off directly into the creek or stream or river that you don't want. So looks like Medway Creek has about 30%, 28.7, while the recommendation is 50%. So there you go. Not super good, but you'll see if you pick another one, it is potentially, it can get worse. Maybe one or two are better. I can't remember. Okay, so your task. So what you're going to do, I want you to pick a watershed of that list that I showed you. Hopefully one that you've actually been in before, one that you live close by to, so maybe you have some connection with it. And you're going to look at the report card for that particular sub-watershed. You're going to download that report card from the link. Again, before I post it, I'm just going to double check to see if I've got the most recent report card there. And number 3, I'm not so sure that you'll be able to do that this time. If it's safe to do, you're welcome to go into that sub watershed and take some pictures. You can take some pictures of the waterway itself, take some pictures of the tree cover. Some of the buds on the hardwood trees are just starting to come out, and you can include those in the presentation. If not, no big deal at all. We don't want you to violate any of the protocols right now, so I'll leave that up to your discretion. Part 4. So you're going to, I've got a template, so a blank template that you're going to fill in and basically put information from that subwatershed report card onto the template. And then, well, we're not in class. You're not going to present it to the class, but you'll just hand it in to me, and I'll post at least one from each subwatershed so everyone gets an idea of the differences in the subwatersheds of the Thames River. Here's a quick look at the template, and then that'll be it for me today. So you're going to include a map of your subwatershed. You're going to look at that report card, and you're going to talk about some of the main features of that watershed. So what are the main land uses? What's the land cover like? Wetland, urban, agriculture, things like that. You're going to talk about the surface water. What grade did it get and why? You're going to talk about the forest conditions. What grade did it get and why? Is it getting better, worse, or staying the same? So they should mention previous report cards compared to the most recent ones, so you can compare previous to now to see if that trend is getting better or worse over time. And any other facts. So each of those sub-watershed report cards will list some other interesting facts about the watershed. So anything that you find interesting there, you can also list. And I think that's it. So hopefully you enjoyed that little look at hydrology, particularly within the London area. And I think I might post one more time later this week with some more information on the hydrosphere, but that should be enough to give you work for the next few days. All right. Thank you. Bye.